Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their legislative priorities, their lives, their opinions, and perspectives that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. June is Pride Month. Every year across California and the U.S. and around the world, various events are held during this special month in celebration of LGBTQ self-identity, inclusivity, and equality, and as a way of raising political awareness and honoring the global influence and impact of the LGBTQ community. The theme for Pride Month 2024 seems to be wrapping up to be Reflect, Empower, and Unite, and is a call to action for all of their allies, especially those in government and the private sector, to demonstrate their alliance with the community at large at this critical time in our nation's history. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll use our conversation about the significance and impact of Pride Month as an opportunity, actually, to get better acquainted with a personal story and policy priorities of a member of California's LGBTQ caucus who has devoted his life to public service in profound ways, dedicated to helping break down walls and removing barriers of prejudice amongst communities. Steve Padilla represents California's 18th Senate District. He calls the city of Chula Vista his home, but he represents portions of the counties of San Diego, Imperial, Riverside, and San Bernardino. Senator Padilla was elected to the state Senate in 2022 after years of service in local government, including time as the mayor of Chula Vista, and elected and re-elected to the Chula Vista City Council, where he had the distinction of being the first person of color ever to be holding city office in Chula Vista, the first Latino mayor, and the first LGBTQ community member to serve or be elected to Chula Vista City office. Additionally, somewhere in there, Senator Padilla served 13 years in law enforcement, beginning in Chula Vista and as a detective in the city of Coronado. Senator Padilla also served on the California Coastal Commission, including time as chair of the commission. And here in 2024, he continues as the chair of the Senate Budget Subcommittee on State Administration and Government and the chair of the Senate Select Committee on California-Mexico Cooperation and Dialogue. And all along, detective, council member, mayor, commissioner, senator Padilla's public service priorities have stayed the same in all the best ways, tackling big issues with big action, as he says, and making life better for communities all over California. This is Senator Padilla's first time joining us on this podcast, so I am looking forward to hearing some of the policy perspectives and personal story, including hearing how it feels to be a first-time grandfather, an achievement that he just recently added to his list earlier this spring. Senator Padilla, it is good to see you. Welcome to Then There's California.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
How are you, by the way?
I am great. I am a happy grandfather.
Well, good. That's great. We had Senator Skinner as a guest last time, and she waxed beautifully about her granddaughter. Give us some reflections about being a grandfather to Ethan,
That's a beautiful
right?
moment. Yes, thank you. Yeah, my grandson Ethan, my first grandchild, born to my daughter Ashley and son-in-law Nelson, who are amazing young professionals in their own right and amazing young parents. And it's a moment in life, right? It's sort of like when you become a parent, you often describe it to others as something you can't quite understand until you've been there.
Yes.
And it puts a lot of things in perspective. And I think that becoming a grandfather certainly it makes you double check everything. You're like, wow, how did that happen so fast?
Right.
5 minutes ago, I was changing my daughter's diapers. Now I don't know what the heck
Exactly.
happened. It's a beautiful thing. I am very much in love with my new grandson.
Well, you said you are the father of a grown daughter, so your policy perspective, you could say, has already been nuanced by thinking of our children's future. But has it also been maybe more deeply influenced by Ethan's presence in your life and thinking of the world he's going to grow up in?
Well, I'd like to think that I try as an individual to always be making time to reflect. And certain seminal moments in your life make you reflect a little more deeply sometimes. And I think that's good and important. And I think throughout my career in trying to do my part to contribute to this thing we call governance and community, and to do it in a thoughtful way, it always requires reflection because it's always about posterity. It's always about what we invest in today for tomorrow. It is always about what we leave behind. It is always about thinking about not just the near-term understood or anticipated impacts of what we do, but what might not be anticipated. And so we have a responsibility to not just act in the moment, but we have a responsibility to act for posterity and for the future. And that requires a little deeper reflection, as you said. And so when you think about, I think about the world today with all of its promise, you think about the peril as well. And I think my thinking is, making sure that I do my part to be part of a state government and part of a community that leaves behind as many opportunities as my grandparents had and I had for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. And sometimes I wonder whether, in fact, that is the case, leaving behind an environment for them that is healthy, both socially and literally, the built environment, the natural environment. What is the public health picture going to look like for people living in future generations, in addition to the economic health of future generations? So we have plenty of challenges today.
Yes.
We have plenty of challenges on the economic front. We have plenty of challenges on the environmental and public health front. And we certainly have our challenges on the social fabric, on our society's front that are being tested very much today. So it's both a little bit of a challenging time to be in public service, but also perhaps one that is going to be distinctive and meaningful in the future.
Well, that's a perfect theme to pivot off on the rest of this conversation. This is your second year of your freshman term. I'm sure last year was time spent learning, adjusting, adapting to this new government experience, even though you weren't a stranger to government. Here in year two, are you feeling a stronger sense of being grounded in the process?
I'm very grateful for the fact that I'm old. And so my having a professional background in law and public policy and then working in government, local, regional, state, doing some federal policy work was a great preparation for coming to the legislature. And I feel a little bit for some of my colleagues who came to the legislature as their first experience serving in government, never have been so much as dog catcher anywhere. And that's quite the steep learning curve. But I think those perspectives are important to be brought into the legislature. So I'm very grateful for the things that I experienced throughout my career, and I think they've helped me. But what's exciting and interesting is that there's always something to learn. Any new institution that you enter has its own unique characteristics and culture and quirks and history and all of that. And you get to work with, I think, overall, some very talented people who all bring something different to the table and are trying to do some thoughtful work to make tomorrow a little bit better than today. And so it's exciting and challenging at once. It's a lot. I represent a district today with about 1.25 million people in 4 different counties, a large geographic area. And it's I tell folks all the time, I call it an everything bagel district because it really is that diverse. I mean, it's a district that is coastal and urban and wealthy and young and hip, and it is suburban, and it is foothills, and it is agricultural, and it is poor, and it is exploited, and it's everything in between. So from a geographical standpoint and from a demographic standpoint, it's very, very diverse. And at times, depending on where in my district I'm at, these 2 different parts have nothing in common, except they all have a need and a desire to have opportunities, to participate in California's economy, to be healthy, to have something positive to leave behind. But it is a very, very distinct and diverse district, which is both exciting and challenging all at the same time.
I appreciate that profile of your district. From the desert to the sea, it's quite a mosaic of California.
I would agree. I mean, and from its makeup, and I would just argue it's a critically important part of the state. I mean, I'm the only member in the legislature who shares the entire California-Mexico border. Right. I have the entire border with California from the ocean to the Colorado River. And I respectfully would submit that I think a lot of folks in California, as forward-thinking as we like to think that we are, don't have a real deep understanding of the binational region and the relationship with Mexico and how important that is for the North American export economy and for the economy as a whole and for the health of California. It's a very unique and challenging but very critical part of the state.
And I want to talk about the impact that border has on legislation and our state here in just a moment. But as we mentioned before, your professional life has always been public service focused. It's pretty common to find former local government leaders, obviously, in the ranks of the legislature, and you have achieved some milestones in that leadership that we can further talk about. But it's not too common to find a former law enforcement officer and a police detective in our midst here at the Capitol. So let's talk about your law enforcement career and how that experience, particularly dealing with cases of domestic violence and child abuse, that must have been a tough beat, and how that impacted your work as a council member, and ultimately here, fast forward to this time, how it's impacting your work in the legislature.
Well, it wasn't a determinative and a meaningful part of my life, and I'm glad I had those experiences. It's funny, folks find that the most fascinating aspect of my career, even though it was, more than a couple of decades ago and before college or law school and before a lot of other professional engagements since then. But I can tell you, I don't think I would have achieved some of the things that I did later in government or professionally had I not had that experience. I went into law enforcement right out of high school. I was accepted to the academy in my senior year at a ripe old age of 18, graduated the academy at the ripe old age of 19. I went into the reserves at that age, which would it tells you how old I am, but back at that time, you were able to get in, even in the reserves, at an age like 19. You weren't old enough to drink in bars, and got my first commission at 21. So in my late teens and early 20s, I was out doing some things that most folks don't dream about doing even later in life. And it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about people. It taught me a lot about reading people's behavior. It taught me about seeing people at their very best, and frankly, seeing people sometimes at their very worst.
I can only imagine.
And it taught me some level of confidence in myself. I was a pretty shy, small kid as a young boy in school, and I think having that experience instilled a sense of self-confidence and a focus on problem solving and a focus on having an immediate, tangible impact on people's lives, which is really important. So it taught me a lot about the world and about people, and I think that I would not have been successful doing other things had I not had that experience.
Absolutely. Well, considering the beat you had of domestic violence and child abuse, from your combination perspective as a former law enforcement officer and a former and current lawmaker, how thoroughly and effectively is California prioritizing domestic violence and child abuse prevention and services and support for survivors? I mean, you have a really nuanced perspective on that, I would imagine.
Well, a lot has evolved since that time. I mean, you think about just the last 4 decades, how society has looked at the dynamic of domestic violence and what that is and what contributes to it. It is a cycle. It is learned behavior. It's not something that people are born with. And there have to be interventions in education, and there have to be a lot that's gone into that, including how law enforcement and prosecutors look at that today in ways they looked at it very differently 50 years ago, and that's appropriate. California in the past led the way, I think, in some early legislation that required intervention. There was a time, believe it or not, when officers would show up on people's doorsteps about somebody having domestic violence or abusing their spouse or something, and would basically make contact with folks and leave the scene and leave the victim there with the abuser because it was considered a domestic private matter. Those days are long gone, and there's a much better understanding of that. So it's still something that plagues our society as a whole, but I think going beyond just looking at it from a law enforcement standpoint, but from a social standpoint.
And a human standpoint.
Exactly. We still wrestle with violence, period, right? We see it everywhere. We see it every day. We raise generations of young children to believe that in some ways, indirectly, and maybe not intentionally, that certain elements of hyper-masculinity and solving problems with violence is to be admired. And I think that's something that as a society we have to grapple.
From environmental quality to coastal protection to AI safety to workers' rights and a living wage to energy transmission to youth content creators, give us a top-line review of your many policy priorities in the Senate this year, not to mention your years in local government. How is all that meshed to what you're working on right now?
Well, I think we've got a pretty solid, broad portfolio of bills. We've in areas we've tried to lead in and contribute to the conversation in. Artificial intelligence and Gen AI is something that is already deployed and active in our society and our world. It's actively functioning in the financial sector right now. It is going to drive the economy, and it's going to, if we thought the transition in the age of the internet was rapid by historic standards, the impact of AI on our economy and our lives is going to take place in an even shorter, much more rapid time frame. And it's going to touch every part of our lives. And so governments have to think about, and nonprofit institutions that think about the public well-being, our best research institutions and educational institutions need to think about how are we participating in this conversation, and how do we capture the benefits of AI while putting up guardrails around protecting people's privacy and rights and safety. And we're already behind the curve. And so I have some bills that will sort of do a couple of things. One, just use the purchasing power of California, which is pretty big, to make sure that we're conforming to certain safety standards when we go out and procure products from vendors for use by the state that look at and conform to some of the standards that we're seeing espoused globally in the European Union, certainly at the federal level, guidance out of the administration, and some of the best practices that experts around the world are talking about in terms of protecting safety and integrity. I have another bill that will create a space. It's an AI hub where we can get multiple sectors together to be kind of in conversation around some of the cutting edge evolution of this technology and how it's applied. Because right now that space is not democratized. Right now it's dominated by largely the private sector holders, a few small portfolios that dominate most of that market right now. And we have to be aware of that. So I've got stuff that deals with building our energy grid up to standard. It's our grandparents' energy grid. And we have these big climate GHG reduction goals that we're so proud of in California. And we've got grandpa's grid going on. And it's not going to handle what we're going to put the demands on it and be ready, particularly with respect to moving renewable energy that comes from renewable sources quickly and efficiently. So I've focused a lot the last couple of years on how do we look at the regulatory process, how can it be improved and shortened while still protecting standards, because we're not going to make it. It takes us an average of 10 years to approve new transmission infrastructure in California. Think about that, 7 to 10 years. That's way too long. You look at our goals for 2035 and 2040, that's around the corner. So that's another space where I've done a lot of work and focus. Certainly environmental justice issues are really right front and center for me right now. I represent a part of California that's unique in that there isn't any other place in California where you are abutting another sovereign state where the infrastructure for solid waste treatment is broken down on both sides of the border.
Yes.
And tens of millions of gallons of raw sewage, as well as industrial waste and runoff and pollution from industrial sources, are flowing daily into the Pacific coast and into some of the most sensitive wetlands and watersheds in all of the state, and poisoning the atmosphere and the waters. We're learning now through new science that it doesn't just pollute water, but it actually becomes aerosolized and gets in the air column, and people breathe that in. We have beaches in my district that have been closed for 2 years. Now I want you to think about that. Can you imagine other parts of the coast of California having their beaches closed for 2 years straight? And what would be happening if that were occurring in other parts of the state?
Yes.
I mean, all hell would be breaking loose. And I think that it's a unique and acute crisis. And so I've got some bills that deal with preventing further pollution to that, further impacts to the watershed by landfills. I've got a bill that would require polluters who intentionally park themselves on the other side of the border and contribute to pollution that ends up in California have to report their activities and what it would cost to clean them up and pay a fee to clean them up if they don't. So I try to be pretty diverse, from dealing with working poverty and workforce standards to energy and certainly to environmental justice and public health. There's a lot going on.
Well, you have alluded to your work on the Tijuana River watershed, and you've made this a policy, and I will say a moral priority here in 2024. And when you talk about the border and when you talk about issues that go back sometimes generations, talk about the removal of these creation of landfills that contaminate the watershed even further. And I know for generations, for years, the public has been trying to fight against this. There's the health issues, there's the environmental issues. I would say your predecessors in this seat have tried to do their best. You're now chair of the committee that deals with U.S. and Mexico, California, Mexico issues. But dive deeper into what you're trying to do with legislation and with this particular watershed that is not only precious, but it's also a health risk.
Right. American Rivers named it one of the most distressed and polluted rivers in North America just in the last couple of weeks. And I represent a portion of the state where portions of my district have some of the highest levels of bacterial and industrial contamination in the watershed and some of the poorest air quality. That affects public health. Some of the children in my district have asthma rates and disease rates that are 2 and 3 and 4 times the regional average and the state average. And that's directly as a result of being exposed to that environment. The problem on the cross-border sewage and contaminants is that we created this agency by treaty with Mexico to manage the resources on both sides of the border and the treatment facilities. And they were, on the Mexican side, to be candid, left to disrepair and not maintained and don't have capacity and basically are almost non-functional. But there is progress being made on both sides of the border to address repairs to bring it up to some standard. including on the U.S. side, where there's been some substantial allocations of funds that will increase a little bit the capacity there and bring that up to standard. The problem is two things. One, even the standard they'll bring it up to once repairs are complete won't have the capacity to handle demand. So it's kind of insane. We're spending money and we're repairing a treatment facility that's designed below the capacity that we need. Secondarily, we never provided a permanent source of funding. These facilities are often at the mercy of the federal budget process, which is, as you know, every couple of years and is sort of a circus. And with something so important and so impactful on two countries, you would think that we would have figured out a way to have a more stable source of revenue. So that's obviously having an impact in the binational region. As I mentioned a minute ago, I've got a couple of bills that would, one, prevent any new landfills from being placed in the Tijuana River watershed. There's a proposal in my district to do just that.
Right.
I represent a part of the state that's had and certainly in San Diego County, southern San Diego County, has had a century-plus history of having adverse environmental uses, pardon the pun, dumped on it, whether that's rendering plants, wrecking yards, junk yards, landfills, power plants, peaker plants, you name it, always shoved down the throats of communities of color that didn't have the economic or political power to fight back at the time.
Exactly.
And that's changed. And so I have a bill to prevent any new landfills in the watershed, and I have a bill that will make polluters who are intentionally doing operations outside of California's border, but whose inputs into the watershed are actually flowing into California. And this builds off a law actually Governor Reagan signed in 1969.
Yes, that's right.
That would basically require that of those folks as well. So party's over in terms of just trucking along, business as usual.
And actually, you bring up a good point, because as we're talking about this, candidly, it's, as you mentioned, the fact that you have these beaches that have been closed for years, and in any other part of the state, this would be raising red flags. Is there a racial and economic bias we've been dealing with for all these years that this isn't happening as quick as it is because of who's living there and because of where it is?
Well, sadly, yes. I mean, I think so. I mean, I grew up with that dynamic. I think that it does matter, and it shouldn't, but it does still today. The people affected aren't always, although it's not cheap to live anywhere in San Diego County. And so I think largely you're looking at a community along the border region, very close to the border, that is communities very diverse, community of color, economically middle class, working class, and poor. And, if this same scenario were occurring somewhere else where there were people of great means, I think things might be a little bit different. And I think that's unfortunate. I think we as a society have to confront that honestly, and we have to think about what our priorities are. But this is one of the biggest environmental injustices and disasters in the state. And most communities along our California coast wouldn't tolerate it for very long.
Let's talk about Pride Month. Reflect, Empower, Unite. That's at least the theme for New York. I assume that's going to spread across the country. San Diego, LA may have other themes. Does that resonate and make sense to you as a theme?
Always, I love New York. I love visiting. But, San Diego Pride always likes to do its own thing. So I imagine we'll come up with some uniquely San Diego.
But I assume in general, these themes are going to reflect celebration, but also some sober thinking too.
I think all over the state, right? I mean, look, again, as I referenced, we're living in a very challenging time. I was always raised to believe that the diversity that we experience around us was something to be proud of and a strength, not to be feared or to be loathed or to be blamed for all of our problems in life. It was always the hallmark of what it meant, what was unique about America, right? What was unique about America was that, out of the many, we are one. But we're one not because we're all the same. Now we seem to be drifting into this sort of consciousness that seems to dictate we're the best when we're all the same. We all should look the same, and we should all think the same, and folks that are different are really the problem. And that turns the American ideal on its head, doesn't it?
Yes.
In fact, it echoes to past experiences in the early 20th century that young minds are probably largely ignorant of today, and even not so young minds that are experiencing economic hardship, don't see themselves able to participate in California's economy because no matter how hard they work or how many hours they work, they can't get ahead. I think that just opens the door for exploitation of people's grievances. And I think we're living in a time where different is bad and different is the problem. And that's a very dangerous mindset in America. I can't think of anything more un-American. And I think as far as the LGBTQ community is, we are, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, I'm a sort of a double threat. I'm a person of color. I'm a Latino, but I'm also an LGBTQ person. I'm an out and proud gay man.
Well, exactly. Senator Menjivar, she talked about that. She called it the triple-edged sword: being a woman, being a Latina, and being
Absolutely.
gay. And you're two of those.
Absolutely. And I think that we have to be vigilant, and we have to remain visible, and we have to think about. Again, this is a living, breathing thing. I think Dr. King during the Civil Rights Movement talked about both that dynamic, the fierce urgency of now, but also the fact that this isn't something that you're one and done and dust your hands and turn the page and move on. That intolerance and hate and bigotry is learned. Right. It's generational.
What's that line from South Pacific? You have to be carefully taught to hate, to despise.
That's right, exactly, and spot on. And I think that we have to remember that maintaining a strong ideal in our culture and all of our institutions about why that's not good for our society is something that we have to keep up and maintain generation after generation. So this is something that's a living, breathing thing, and it's a living, breathing obligation. And in the LGBTQ community, we have to be visible and remind folks that we're here, that we're not going anywhere, and that we are an intricate, embedded part of our community, always have been, always will be, part of the human family. And I think that it's an opportunity to remind folks about that, about what that means, and why that's important to our survival.
Indeed. You have mentioned some of the milestones that you grew up with, and also in your leadership and your capacity in Chula Vista. First person of color ever elected to the city, the first Latino mayor, the first openly LGBTQ person to serve. Were you welcomed, if not celebrated, in this history making that you were doing, considering the time? Talk about that experience.
We're getting deep now. This is the hard part of the conversation.
And we may go a little deeper at your pleasure, but anyway, at that time you were making history, but was that hard in what really has traditionally been a pretty conservative part of the state?
It was a lot of things. It was certainly defining and seminal in my life. I'd been married and a young daughter. Obviously, had struggled, I think, off and on throughout most of my young life. Understanding, the human mind is an interesting thing. You can convince yourself about just about anything. You can block off access to just about anything that you don't want to actually understand or deal with because it's painful or difficult. I think anyone who's ever wrestled with coming out completely understand that. The social and personal internal pressures that are present can be debilitating. And one thing I'm grateful for is that I didn't let that go on for most of my life. So I'm grateful for that. But it took losing a parent suddenly, I think. I lost my mother very suddenly, who I was very close to, which caused a deep reflection about life and what it meant and what you do with it. And the experience was a lot of things for me. I was very fortunate in that I had an amazing family and siblings and community that were loving and supportive and understanding in a personal way. But, I was the mayor of the second largest city in the county at the time. And my coming out was very public. As a matter of fact, as I've discussed before, someone I'd served with in local government and known for many years now by the name of Tony Atkins was a part of that coming out story with me. And we were at a rally together for San Diego Pride. And I was there as the mayor. And I was there to present a proclamation, the very first one ever from the city of Chula Vista, recognizing, the existence, and never mind the contributions of the LGBTQ community throughout San Diego County. And they had legislators down from all over the state. Mark Leno was there, Christine Kehoe was there, folks from up and down the state who'd served in office and been leaders in the LGBT community, and also locally. And I had never discussed my sexuality publicly, ever. But I had decided in that moment, because of a lot of the things that had been going on. Prop 22 had been on the ballot just prior to that. There had been propositions that had attempted to go at the civil rights and equality of LGBTQ community members. And there was a lot going on. And I remember I was supposed to go out on that stage and present this proclamation. And a lot of folks in that audience knew it was sort of an open secret that I was gay, but I didn't feel that it would be something of integrity for me to go out and present it and not acknowledge that I was a member of that community. And right before we're about to go out on stage, I was back in the green room with Tony. And Tony was introducing me. Interestingly enough, she was the acting mayor of San Diego at the time. And I said, when you introduce me as a member of the community. And she said, are you sure? She did. And everybody lost their mind. It was great. Because I didn't realize at the time. And Tony was acting mayor because the mayor in San Diego had resigned. But Chula Vista instantly became the largest city in the U.S. with an openly serving gay mayor. And it became a national story for a period. Now, the good side of that was I saw some beautiful things in my community. I had some outreach, and some people wrote to me from all over the country and from all over my community. And then I saw some of the ugly side, where my integrity, my morality, my personal worth was questioned. And I was, to be honest, I was challenged for re-election by the wife of a former mayor, conservative, that was very popular with a very popular last name. And I think, to be candid, in large part because I had come out in office. I mean, no doubt there were things to criticize because none of us are without fault or mistake. And I had my share. But the reality was, I don't believe I would have been challenged at all if that one key salient opportunity had not presented itself by me opening my mouth and acknowledging that I was gay. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, told other people, hey, there's a huge opportunity here. He just told everybody he's gay. Now a bunch of people are going to hate him and come after him. And they were correct. But what I ended up experiencing as well was the death threats and the crazy people coming to my office and having to have security because people were, showing up in my lobby with guns and cereal boxes and stupid things like that, which really make you realize that, there's some folks out there that aren't of sound mind, and you have to take that seriously. And so that itself became a cause celeb, and that was tough. That was a tough time. I lost my bid for re-election, and I will always believe that it was in large part because folks did not want to have a gay mayor. Now, that said, what's interesting is after many years of having to never give up on my community, staying engaged, doing some work in the private sector and the nonprofit sector, and moving on and reflecting and then rebuilding my career over many years, was I ultimately came back and was elected as an openly gay candidate. And I will never forget when I came back to government, came back and was elected to the city council as an openly gay person. And the first time that they flew the pride flag at City Hall, I just wept. I just stood there and cried because I had recalled not that many years prior, I think it was literally a decade prior, where it was a very different, painful experience. I left City Hall on the last night in office, having turned the gavel over to my successor who had defeated me, feeling very, not just politically rejected, but very personally rejected by my community. And that was a very painful experience. And then to be back at City Hall and watch them raise the pride flag was quite a moment for me.
Thank you for sharing that. It brings a question to my mind, as cliche as it sounds, but I sense the answer will not be cliche.
I hope not.
The pain and the heartbreak and the ugliness that you talk about that you dealt with, was it worth getting to this point of pride, if you'll pardon the expression, and self-fulfillment that Steve Padilla is feeling now?
One is blessed if you can have yourself, right? There's an old lyric about, if not yourself, what do you have, right? And all of us have God-given right to live with integrity and be ourselves and all of whatever that is. And that's a gift, and it's a gift that a lot of folks unknowingly take for granted if you haven't walked in the shoes of an LGBTQ person, because you can just be. You think nothing of walking down the street and grabbing your girlfriend's hand or your wife's hand, right? No one's going to notice that or judge you for that or be violent with you for that, because you're doing what most people do. But to understand what it's like to live in fear of just being who you are, for fear of someone getting offended to the point that they could get violent, That's a very unique and different experience for folks. And it's something that I think LGBTQ people have lived with for centuries. And so we're fortunate. I was fortunate that I had support, but I also had quite a rude awakening. And at the end of the day, to answer your question, all of those experiences, I would like to think, help make me be a better, more reflective person, which in turn, I hope, makes me a better representative. I don't want to relive those experiences, certainly,
right.
But I don't want to ever forget what I learned from them, because they were some difficult times.
And hopefully Ethan, in his time, can learn, and wherever his life goes, wherever his choices take him, he can learn from what his grandfather has gone through.
I hope so. He's got a lot of love around him and a lot of folks that want to teach him different things. And they were all sitting, one of my ex wants to teach him to play piano, and one of my other family members wants to teach him to speak Spanish, and all these different things. Everybody's excited to teach him. And we were sitting around as a family a couple of weekends ago, and they said, well, what are you going to teach him, Dad? And I thought about it for a minute. And of course, maybe this is cliche, but I said, I'm going to be the one that teaches him about his obligation to others, that he doesn't live in a vacuum and it isn't all about him.
That's wonderful. One of the things to celebrate with the gay community, LGBTQ community here in California, but all over the world, really, is this incandescent fearlessness, refusing to be invisible, fighting to be able to love somebody without it being a political statement or something you have to fear. Does that fearlessness sustain the community? And to talk to a young person who's having those same questions you did, encouraging them to be sustained by that, by the people that have come before them, but their peers as well.
Absolutely. I mean, Harvey Milk was right. It was painful, and he paid a big price for it.
Yes, he did.
But he was right. You can't allow yourself to be invisible or be invisible for the convenience or comfort of others. We are part of this community and this society and this good earth here, going through the same challenges and struggles that anyone else is. And we need to be able to celebrate that opportunity and that beauty, and we need to show that to others. And right now, there are young people that are trapped in cultures and family systems and others that don't respect any individuality at all. It's all about conformity. It's all about control. It's all about one idea about the world. And that can be very deadly and damaging. There are young kids, teenagers right now coming of age that are LGBT, and they have a higher suicide rate than the national average because they are experiencing those pressures. We have young trans people who are the victim of just outright disgusting anger and discrimination.
It can be crushing. I can only imagine.
Aimed at, again, trifling politically and socially with something that is very medically and psychologically complex and complex to the soul. And to screw around with that in an irresponsible way is devastating and damaging. It's shameful. I think I saw somewhere today, it was a governor somewhere signed a piece of legislation mandating that in schools in his state that kids can only use the restroom their assigned gender. But it indicates a complete ignorance of human sexual identity and expression, or about what gender dysphoria is.
And especially in these times when we should know this, when we should be educated on this.
Look, I don't want to sound crass, but the Earth's not flat. Okay?
Yeah.
So,
there's a lot of people that would debate you on that.
There might be some folks out there that might be upset by that and shocked, but I got a news flash for you. Earth ain't flat. And I think that's, again, it's troubling in the 21st century that we're dealing with a situation where people can believe the darndest things and use that, weaponize that in a way to harm other human beings. It's unfortunate because we should be thinking about every day how we can make life better for one another.
Right. Looking at yourself personally, your life personally, fast forwarding to the last few years, is your ex supportive? Your daughter supportive? The people around you?
I am a member of a ultra modern, amazing family. I have an ex-wife. I have an ex-husband. I have great friends that are family. I have a huge network. My family is a network of family and friends, genetic family and family we've chosen for ourselves that love and support one another. And it's a beautiful thing. My grandson, Ethan's going to have a lot of people to love him
What a blessing.
Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you for sharing all of this. Final question, as we talk about the fragility of government, the fragility of society, of thought, fragility of life. During the pandemic, I was humbled, surprised to read that you had caught COVID. You were hospitalized. You were on a ventilator for several days. You almost died. Having survived that extreme health crisis, diving into your first year in the Senate, being a father, taking on the role now of being a grandpa, standing taller and prouder with your community. How is life for Steve Padilla?
It's a gift. Every day is a gift. And, again, we've thrown around the word cliche a couple of times. I don't want to sound that way. But wow. I mean, I got to tell you, I had the dubious distinction of being the first official in California to have COVID. I was the chairman of the Coastal Commission at the time. It was early March of 2020. Actually had a hearing up in the Bay Area that I ended up leaving early, right when things were getting interesting. And I was in hospital for a few weeks. I was in ICU for a couple of weeks and on a ventilator for 11 days and was not expected to survive. And I did. And I couldn't walk, couldn't lift my head. When I woke up in ICU, I had to stay with family for 6 months. My son-in-law literally had to pick me up and carry me. And so, you talk about some experiences in life. I can tell you this. When you've experienced something like that, it does make you deeply reflect, at least for me, about life. What are you doing with your time? Does it bring you joy? Is it meaningful? What are you doing here? And you really do think deeply about that. And it does. It's not something I'd recommend for folks to get grounded with, but it does make you reflect, and it does ground you quite a bit. And it did for me. And I'm very much even more aware every day about what am I putting my time and energy into? Is it meaningful? And am I appreciating life? And I think about that every day.
Thank you for this meaningful conversation. It is a pleasure to meet you podcast-wise and personally, and hope we can have you back again sooner than later.
Absolutely, would love it. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Senator Steve Padilla from Chula Vista, representing California's 18th Senate District, member of the Legislative Latino Caucus and the LGBTQ Legislative Caucus. He is the chair of the Senate Budget Subcommittee on State Administration and Government. And that brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and production support from John Roman, Ben Abaya, Nick Boulay, Brian Shadden, Michelle Baker, Sergio Reyes, McLenna Woods, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.